Comparative advantage and specialization are the basis for trade. Here's a typical scenario that we would look at in determining comparative advantage and then trade. So first of all, we're talking about two people in 1 hour have different outputs. You can chop 2 logs or haul 4 buckets of water. Your friend can chop 3 logs or haul 5 buckets of water. The first thing that we'd want to do is create what we call an absolute advantage chart. And an absolute advantage chart is just going to have in chart form the information that we looked at here. So we have you and we have your friend. We have logs and we have buckets. All you have to do now is figure out who does what, going back to this. So you can chop 2 logs or haul 4 buckets. Your friend can chop 3 logs or haul 5 buckets. Your friend has absolute advantage in both categories. We find absolute advantage by saying who can produce the fastest or who can produce the most. So in this case, your friend, like who produces more logs, the friend does. Who produces more buckets, the friend does. So your friend has absolute advantage in both areas. And I'll just give a light circle around each one so we know who's who. Since your friend is better at both, what should you produce? For that we use comparative advantage. Comparative advantage basically figures out who can produce the cheapest or at the lowest cost. To find comparative advantage, we're going to start off by setting up our same chart as we had before. So we have logs, buckets, you, and your friend. What we're going to do now is figure out how much these items cost you guys and therefore figure out who's the cheapest. Well, for you, 2 logs cost 4 buckets. 4 buckets would cost 2 logs. This allows us to use what we call the output method to solve these problems. Imagine yourself picking up a number and putting it over the number in the other box. So our rule of thumb here is output over. So we would say 2 over 4, and over here it would be 4 over 2. I just picked up the 4 and put it over the 2. When you reduce these, obviously you get 2, and when you reduce these, you get 0.5. So what's happening here? In other words, we're saying 1 log costs you 2 buckets. 1 bucket costs you a half log. For your friend, we're going to do the same thing. We would take our 3 and put it over the 5. So 3 over 5, which is 0.6. We take the 5 and put it over the 3. That's 1.67. A log costs your friend 1.67 buckets. A bucket costs your friend 0.6 logs. Comparative advantage means who's cheaper. When you look at logs, your friend is the lower cost producer of logs, so we'll circle them. You are the lower cost producer of buckets. This tells us who should produce what. You should produce only buckets and your friend should only chop logs. From that point, you can trade with each other to get the combinations of the two goods that you want. Absolute advantage gives us an opportunity to look at countries' production possibilities curves. If we take a graph for you and we put logs on one axis and buckets on the other, we can graph your production possibilities. Because as we said before, you can produce either 2 logs or 4 buckets. These are your production possibilities. Now you'd have the option of maybe producing 1 log and then getting 2 buckets and so on and so forth. So you can do 2 logs, 4 buckets, or anything in between. How does trade benefit you? In order to do that, we'll have to determine the terms on which people are going to trade. So let's go back over to the comparative advantage chart to figure that out. It costs you, and you're going to produce buckets, and it costs you a half log to make a bucket. Well, if it costs you a half log to make a bucket, then this is your minimum price. In other words, you wouldn't sell a bucket for anything less than it costs you to make. So far we know that one bucket is going to equal at least 0.5 logs. That's your cost. Now, if you could sell a bucket for 50 logs or 100 logs or 2 logs, you would do it. The question then becomes, well, how much is your friend willing to pay for that same bucket? Well, it costs your friend zero point 0.6 logs to make a bucket. So if you tried to charge that person any more than 0.6, then they would just make it themselves because that would be cheaper. So we know that the bucket is at least 0.5 logs, but not more than 0.6 logs. The price range that these two parties will agree to is going to be somewhere in between 0.5 and 0.6. Now, for this, we could do the same thing for logs. Who's producing logs? Your friend is. So you know 1 log equals at least, so we're in the same spot, and this is just going to work out to be the reciprocal. 1 log is going to equal at least 1.67. Again, not going to sell it for anything less than it costs him or her to make it. But they won't be able to trade for anything more than 2, because if they try to charge you 2 buckets to get a log, you would just make it yourself, or more than 2 buckets. So it's going to be somewhere between 1.67 and 2. So 1 bucket is at least 0.5 logs, but not more than 0.6. 1 log is equal to 1.67 buckets, but not more than 2. Now it's time to figure out what each party gains from trade. In order to do that, we have to just assume some kind of trading or some kind of exchange rate. In our last section, we determined what the trading rate or what the ranges would be for prices or exchange rates. So now we're just going to pick a number that falls in between. So we'll start off with buckets. We know that 1 bucket is going to equal somewhere between 0.5 and 0.6 logs. So let's just say that it's going to be right in the middle. 1 bucket equals 0.55 logs. So now in that case, we know that every bucket that you produce is going to get you 0.55 logs and vice versa. And you are the person producing buckets. So first of all, assume that you produce all buckets. How many buckets can you produce? Well, then we come over here and look at this. You can produce 4 buckets. And each 4 buckets gets you 0.55 logs, assuming you traded them all away. So you're going to produce the same 4 buckets. So we're back here. We're going to still produce at this level. But now we could trade. What if we traded all of it away for logs? Well, in that case, you would just multiply the 0.55 times 4, and the answer to that is 2.2. So with trade, you would have a choice between 4 buckets and 2.2 logs. Without trade, you could only have 4 buckets and 2 logs. This curve we call a consumption possibilities curve because it shows you what you could actually consume. And this is the gift of trade, is that it allows us to consume beyond what we are able to produce. So you can see that you would be better off in this case with trade. What do you gain from trade? Well, the difference between what you would have had before versus what you would have had after. So in this case, you gain 0.2 logs.